Welcome back to Painting Trafalgar. This is my seventh installment, I believe. Today I want to talk a little bit about the size of the ships. In the battle, there were a lot of ships of each navy, and when we describe them and when you read about them in books, they talk about how many guns they carried, because the number of guns each ship carried was a easy way to distinguish one from another. And they actually created a system called the rating system, where if your number of guns fell between one number and another, it would put you into a bracket. So the more guns you had on your ship, the lower the number of the class. So a first class ship had, I think it was 96 or 98 guns. And on these drawings here, you can see the diminishing sizes of the ships. The ones with the most guns are certainly higher, and they have this sense of gravitas. They're bigger. So this is probably a 100-gun ship, and this is like a 74. So there's two gun decks that go all the way from the stern all the way to the bow, and the little squares are where the cannons are. And here's a first rate, 3 continuous gun decks from the bow to the stern, one atop the other, stacked up. Here's a drawing of the HMS Victory showing the gun decks. 1, 2, 3, continuous. And something else on here is the scale at the bottom. Each one of these little squares is a foot. And then every 2 of these is 5 feet, or 10 feet. And you'll notice the scale stops before it gets all the way to the end. It comes all the way to the stern, and the scale stops before it gets to the extreme length of the hull. And if you look carefully, there's a vertical line starting right here where the rudder post is located. And the rudder post is more or less perpendicular to the waterline. And there's another piece of wood in the ship called the stem, and there's a point at the front of at the forward edge of the hull where the stem can be found on the interior of the ship, and it corresponds with the end of the gun deck. And here's this little vertical here is the imaginary line showing the forwardmost perpendicular. So even to this day, when we talk about measuring ships, we talk about the length between perpendiculars. So this is one of the perpendiculars, and this is another one of the perpendiculars. When we talk about length in a modern ship, we usually think in terms of the overall length, and that would be from this point to this point, minus the rigging, because as you know, the rigging adds tremendously to the overall length. So in the older days that we're talking about, they spoke about the length between perpendiculars. They spoke about the length of the keel. The keel was the first piece of wood that they laid down when they built the ship, and they built everything on top of it. And the keel has a certain length too, which is short of the length between perpendiculars. Anyway, length between perpendiculars is going to come into this discussion, I promise you. The other measure of a ship would be how wide it was. So here's a view looking straight down at Victory's deck. And there's a point, this is the bow, this is the stern. There's a point where it is at its widest. And they called that the beam, B-E-A-M. And they still use that term today. And it's measured the same way. The beam is the extreme width. We don't use the perpendicular system. It's how wide it is. And then some persnickety people will even talk about whether they took the measurement on the inside of the planking or on the outside of the planking. But it's another way of measuring the sizes of the ships. And if you were like me, and you make a big chart showing the names of all the ships, the best way to codify them is by the name and their nationality, the class, and how many guns they're carrying, and then the tonnage, the length, and the beam. Because that's a good way to get a rule of thumb to describe how one ship is bigger than another. And so some of the ships had 80 guns, some had 74. Here's a 100-gun ship, the Rayo. 80-gun ship, the Formidable. This sheet represents the Franco-Spanish fleet. And the Santissima Trinidad had 136 guns. She was the biggest ship ever, largest ship in the world. And she had 4 continuous gun decks. So she's not even on this scale. She, you know, for some reason we paused. Oh, here we go. Are we still going? Maybe that's somebody telling me to move on. The Santissima Trinidad had 4 of these gun decks, so she was unusual. Anyway, I wanted to talk about these factors. I'm working on this model, which is the 74 gun ship model, and it's a waterline model, meaning that it doesn't show the underwater hull. It ends right where the water would be touching the hull. And then there's this HMS Victory model that I built 20 years ago or 25 years ago, and it has a waterline and the underwater hull. The entire ship has been represented right down to the keel. So that perpendicular I was talking about forward would be here, and the one all the way aft would follow this line. In this case, the rudder came off this model, so I can kind of show you even better. Like, that's the rudder. We're measuring from this point where it crosses the gun deck up here. So I built the 2 models, this one out of the box, this one with the purpose of doing photographs of it. So I didn't want to make the underwater hull because I was going to place it on a blue surface to represent the water and photograph it that way. I made it as big as I could by going to my local printer, like I did for this print. The local printer, the largest print he could make was 36 inches wide. So when I set up the diagrams to make my my model of the 74, I made the hull pretty wide. Not 36 inches, but pretty wide. This is a long way of explaining a weird coincidence. When I started finishing the model, and I had it where I could measure the perpendiculars and such forth, I decided to compare it to the model that I had, and I was a little bit surprised that they were very similar. The number of guns on the HMS Victory, there's 100 and more, suggested to me that she's bigger, right? She's bigger. She's certainly more massive. She's higher out of the water. But it turns out that her overall length of the HMS Victory, that is the length, we're going to say the length on the gun deck, because those are the 2 numbers I could find easily. On the Victory, the gun deck length is 184 feet. So measuring from this point to a point back in here is 184 feet. And the same measurement on the 74 gun ship is 183 feet. So it's just 1 foot difference in the overall gun deck length, which surprised me. Because the HMS Victory has over 100 guns and the 74 has about 74. Sometimes as many as 80 if they cram some in, but they're called 74s. So the beam of the ship, that is the width, right? So that's measuring from the outside edge to the outside edge at its widest point. On the Victory, it's 51 feet 10 inches. And on the Temeraire class ships, it's 48 feet 8 inches. So just a few feet, more narrow. The difference is in the tonnage. The tonnage of the Victory, 2,162 tons. The tonnage on the Temeraire class ship, 1,886 tons. And the other difference is the crew. Like I said, this ship has more guns, and it requires more people to use all the guns. Why would you sail without enough guys to fire all the guns? That's the point. The whole point of the ship is to get those guns to a point that where you want to project force, which is not a term they would have used back then. But you need all those crew. So the crew on Victory, 800 roughly, and the crew on the Temeraire class ship, 630, because fewer guns. However, we have to kind of get into another factor that's involved in the math here. The lower the guns are, the bigger they are. You want your weight to be as low down as possible on a sailing vessel, because if you put the weight higher up, if I put if I put 1,000 pounds up here, the boat is definitely going to swing back and forth like a pendulum, as that weight wants to swing back and forth. But if I put the weight down low, like on a metronome, you can change the pace by moving that weight on the slider. It makes the swinging less dramatic. So you put heavy guns on the lowest tier, medium-sized and smaller guns as you go up higher. And it's the same on all the ships. The smaller guns are the ones that are visible. The ones that you see out there on the deck are the tiniest little pop guns. And the other ones, the 36-pound guns all the way down below, are enormous. They're like 14 feet long or 12 feet long or something ridiculous like that. They're monsters. So if you were to load up all the guns on one side, you'd have a separate size cannonball for the lower guns, a bigger size for the 36-inch guns, the 36-pound guns, I'm sorry. The next tier up, you have a 24-pounder guns, and that is a 24-pound cannonball. It's a smaller sphere of metal. And then 18-pounder guns higher up. So if you were to take one cannonball from each one of these guns on one side of the ship and weigh them on a scale, you'd get what they call the broadside weight of metal. The broadside weight of metal is what the entire ship can fire in one salvo. If you fire all the guns at once and each gun fires just one cannonball, you collect all those cannonballs and weigh them. On the Victory, you're going to get 1,194 pounds of metal from one discharge of all the cannon. Now, if you do the same thing on the Temeraire class, and she has fewer guns, right? Your broadside weight of metal is 1,178. So Victory, 1,194. Temeraire, 1,178. So it's not that much difference. And the reason is that there are fewer smaller caliber guns because she doesn't have that third deck. She's got the same 36-pound guns down close to the waterline and the same 24-pounder guns that the Victory would have. Right? She just doesn't have as many of these 24-pound and 18-pound guns up higher. So if you're doing the math, you're looking at those first-rate ships of the line and saying to yourself, well, I have a lot of prestige and I can put firepower together, but it turns out that that extra firepower isn't really taking you much higher into a greater category than a smaller ship with fewer guys that you got to feed and administer and look after. Imagine you're a manager and you have to manage the daily lives of 800 people versus 600 and change, 630. It's a lot easier to feed and clothe and get water for and worry about the diseases of and the training of and the hierarchy of 630 people versus 800 people. And you're getting, with a ship like this, very nearly the same broadside weight of metal. So, and actually, you're also getting a better sailing ship. The heavier a ship gets, the tons is higher. 2,162 tons for the Victory and 1,886. I mean, they're close, but still, this ship is handier. It's going to be able to maneuver better. It doesn't have the same mass and weight. And furthermore, it doesn't cost as much to build. And like I said, you don't have as much administrative costs of all those people and so on and so forth. So why do the navies have these enormous ships like the Santissima Trinidad with 4 decks? It doesn't make any sense. And in fact, the French, one of the aspects of Napoleon taking over from the monarchy was the French Revolution. One of the things they did was they just put science in the forefront. And they ignored a lot of the old traditions, for better or for worse. But they did embrace the 74. The only ships that they had at the Battle of Trafalgar that were bigger than a 74-gun ship, they had 3 or 4 80-gun ships. And that was it. The most formidable French ship at the battle was not a giant 3-deck ship and certainly not a 4-deck ship. So the French were wisely putting their money into the 74s. Whereas tradition, honor, ego, all those things combined to encourage the great naval powers to build these huge ships. Like the Santissima Trinidad is not considered to be a successful ship. She participated in a few battles and stuff, and the people who went up against her were probably nervous to do so. But you could argue that using the same amount of money, effort, material, and manpower and crew on a Santissima Trinidad and getting yourself 2 74s instead would have been a better decision. But there's the national honor. The Spanish were able to say, we have the world's largest ship in our magnificent Royal Navy. And they did. I think that's all I got for you. Oh, one last thing. Because I was going to photograph these ships together once I decided that they were close enough in scale, I wanted to make the HMS Victory into a waterline model. So I cut it in half. I sawed it along its length, nearly at the waterline. So I can actually pop it off its hull. And I was left with this weird clamshell looking thing, which you weren't, intended to see that. But then, for the sake of argument, I decided, what would it be like if I put my waterline model onto the hull of the Victory? And I was very surprised to see how closely they fit. They fit pretty good. It's not a bad match. It almost looks like it was supposed to be that way. And this weird, happy circumstance of accidentally having built the ship to nearly the same scale as the Victory allowed me to do this. And it was then that I wanted to look up the differences in their length. Because I had assumed that because the Victory had greater tonnage and more guns, that her waterline length and her gun deck length would be a little longer. It turns out that's not the case. It's almost exactly the same. So the difference is in the height above the waterline is higher on the Victory. And that's about it. So it looks to me like you could take all the rigging and the masts and everything off of this ship and put it onto the Victory. And it wouldn't, it wouldn't be unworkable. It would be, dumb thing to do. I guess one last note before I go, I'll explain why they are the same length. And part of the reason was, if you were a ship designer in ye old sailing ship days and your goal was to make a powerful ship, you would make it as long as possible to put as many guns as possible in a long line, but you were limited. You couldn't just keep making them longer and longer and longer. You were limited by the available trees. Like your keel, which is the piece of wood that's all the way on the bottom on these drawings. Let's go back here. The keel would be buried underneath here. And, in the shipyard when you're building it, the keel would be the first thing you lay down and you build the ship on top of the keel. The keel has to be as strong and as straight as possible. And they would sometimes scarf together lengths but ideally they would have one continuous log. That would be your strongest. It's going to be the spine of your ship. It's going to be the backbone. You don't want the keel to bend or break or twist. So you try to make the keel as cohesive and strong as it could be. So you're limited by how many trees were available and how long the straight lengths of trees were. And it wasn't until they developed iron construction that they could finally start making ships any longer. Because if they made them very much longer, they could start bending when the water would lift one part on a wave and then another part would be dangling in the air almost. You'd get these forces trying to bend it, and you would break the backs of ships sometimes in bad weather. So it was the keel length that was one of the determining factors. So to make a 100-gun ship or a 136-gun ship, you had to use the same water length, more or less, and you could stack up more cannon on top of it. But there's also upper limits to that too. Anyway, that's all I got. I'm 18 minutes into this. It's too long already. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks. This has been Painting Trafalgar.